Now, let's consider the second challenge we face. Negative reports about Jehovah's Witnesses in the media. Now, here's a good principle to follow. Proverbs 14 and verse 15. It says, "The naive person believes every word, but the shrewd one ponders each step." Some people believe everything they read in the newspaper or see on TV. Do you? Should you? Consider this. Now, you're working from door to door, and you meet a householder who says, "You Jehovah's Witnesses are terrible people. You let your children die. You don't accept medical treatment." Well, you ask the householder, "Do you know any of Jehovah's Witnesses personally?" "No." "Then where did you get the idea that we let our children die and don't accept medical treatment?" The householder says, "I have it on good authority. I read it in the newspaper." Well, if it's in the newspaper, it must be true, right? Not necessarily. Remember this. Reporters have a deadline to meet, and a reporter may not have the time or the inclination to check the facts. Or the reporter may have written a balanced article, but then the editor changes it. Maybe the editor doesn't like Jehovah's Witnesses, or he's been misinformed about us. Now, it's bad enough if people in the world believe everything they read in the newspaper, but brothers, let's not be among them. Let's not be naive. Let's consider things carefully. Similarly, sometimes there's a TV program about Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, a few of these programs are balanced and fair. Many, or I dare say most, are not. And when they're not, you'll often find that the producers started out with a negative view of Jehovah's Witnesses, and then they looked for information to support their prejudice. So, whom did they turn to? Apostates and the clergy. From them, they got suggestions for people to interview, and we know what those people would say. At the very last minute, they may ask the brothers for comment just to give an appearance of fairness, but the program wasn't designed to be fair. It was designed to be unfair. It was slanted against Jehovah's Witnesses.
This is just the David Splane version of Donald Trump jumping up and down crying fake news, isn't it? Apparently, if there's anything negative in the media, if there's any show, any documentary, any news piece that has anything negative to say about the organization or presents Jehovah's Witnesses in a remotely negative light, ignore it. It must be fake. It's only going to be truthful, conveniently for David, if it portrays Jehovah's Witnesses in a favorable light. Well, why don't you give us some examples, David? Why don't you give us an example of a show, of a documentary that is fake news or that does say things about Jehovah's Witnesses that are untrue in your opinion, and let's be the judge ourselves as to whether your claims are valid. Why don't you dignify Jehovah's Witnesses with figuring this out for themselves instead of talking down to them in this incredibly patronizing way, suggesting that Jehovah's Witnesses aren't capable of sorting fact from fiction?
Some people believe everything they read in the newspaper or see on TV. Do you? Should you? Now, it's bad enough if people in the world believe everything they read in the newspaper, but brothers, let's not be among them. Let's not be naive.
It's ironic, if you think about it, that this is exactly the sort of gullibility that David Splane and his colleagues want Jehovah's Witnesses to have whenever they're reading Jehovah's Witness publications. If a Jehovah's Witness is on jw.org, or watching a JW Broadcasting episode, or reading a Watchtower magazine, they are to unquestioningly believe anything that's said to them. They are to take as fact anything that's said. Apparently, it's only when they're reading the newspaper, or only when they're watching the news, or only when they're watching a documentary about Jehovah's Witnesses that they get to start using critical thinking skills, that they need to be suspicious as to whether the information is accurate or not. And honestly, we're seeing evidence in this very talk that there is reasonable basis for suspicion when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses reviewing the information given to them by their leaders. David Splane here is giving a bad argument, or is raising an argument against Jehovah's Witnesses that's actually valid, and spinning it as though it's somehow a lie.
Now, you're working from door to door, and you meet a householder who says, "You Jehovah's Witnesses are terrible people. You let your children die. You don't accept medical treatment." Well, you ask the householder, "Do you know any of Jehovah's Witnesses personally?" "No." "Then where did you get the idea that we let our children die and don't accept medical treatment?"
If you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, I have to ask you the question, is it not a valid argument you let your children die? Of course it is. Obviously, we're talking here about blood transfusions. And if a Jehovah's Witness child needs a blood transfusion, or else they're going to die, Jehovah's Witness parents are expected to let them die unless the courts intervene. We even had, not so long ago, the story of Jared Scepter on a JW Broadcasting episode. I made a video about it. A thumbnail will be here if Tibor is gracious. Jehovah's Witnesses know that this is how it works. If you are a child of Jehovah's Witness parents, you will be expected to die, to martyr yourself, if a blood transfusion is the only way of saving your life. That's, in essence, what this argument is. And yet David Splane is presenting it as though it's misleading, as though it's in some way a false argument. Same thing with "you don't accept medical treatment." Clearly this is talking about blood transfusions. So if you were a Jehovah's Witness and you were confronted with this argument, you'd know that this is what the householder is talking about. You'd know that they're talking about blood transfusions, and that when it comes to letting children die, that is true. And when it comes to refusing medicine, if that medicine is a blood transfusion, that is also true. What's happening here is David Splane is constructing a straw man argument where certain words are left out, and the argument against Jehovah's Witnesses is made to sound more sensationalist, slightly more sensationalist than the truth of the matter. And having constructed this exaggerated scenario, he's essentially turning around to Jehovah's Witnesses and laying the blame on apostates and the media, even though the basis of the argument, even though it was poorly worded, the basis of the argument is valid. And he doesn't even try to address that argument. He doesn't even try to explain why it's right that Jehovah's Witness parents, like the parents of Jared Scepter, let their children die. He doesn't even try to explain how it can be that Jehovah's Witnesses should be pressured to refuse certain types of medical treatment to the point where you can be disassociated as one of Jehovah's Witnesses if you willfully and unrepentantly, I'm quoting from the Shepherd book, by the way, if you willfully and unrepentantly accept a blood transfusion. There's a penalty attached to accepting some forms of medical treatment. So what he's doing, in a nutshell, is manipulating his audience, is frankly lying to his audience in just the same slimy way that we're supposed to believe apostates go around misleading people.
Now, let's be clear. Some news organizations are very conscientious about their reporting, and they want to present both sides of an issue. And when Jehovah's Witnesses are concerned, they do so at their cost. If a newspaper publishes anything positive about us, the churches will push back. Our parishioners are upset. They subscribe to your newspaper, and they don't like reading favorable things about Jehovah's Witnesses. The message? If it ever happens again, you're going to lose subscribers. Now, this matter of Jehovah's people being the subject of malicious reports isn't new. Think about the days of Queen Esther. Wicked Haman brings a bad report to King Ahasuerus. The Jews don't obey our laws. They're a danger to society. Does Ahasuerus check the facts? Does he demand proof? No. Ahasuerus is naive. He allows himself to be taken in by Haman. Well, there are a lot of modern-day Hamans today, and they use similar tactics. As a result, some government officials are taken in. They believe the slanderous accusations of the apostates. Now, if they just take the time to check the facts, they'd see that they're being lied to, but they don't check the facts. Now, again, it's bad enough, brothers, when government officials are taken in by false reports. Don't you be taken in. Have you ever heard the expression trial by media? It works like this. Someone's charged with a crime, and the case is widely publicized in the media, and the media present the case in such a way that everyone who hears about it thinks the man is guilty. Now, of course, to avoid a lawsuit for slander or libel, these media reports are very carefully worded, and we need to understand what the wording means. Here's a good principle to keep in mind. Job chapter 12 and verse 11. Does not the ear test out words as the tongue tastes food? Does not the ear test out words? What does that mean? Does it mean that if we learn that apostates are going to be featured on a TV program, we should watch it to see if what they say is true? No. It basically means to consider the source of the words. If they are the words of apostates, why would we believe them? Now think of it this way. You have a bottle on your shelf that's marked poison. Do you need to open it up, take a swig, to see if it really is poison? Believe what the label says.
This is just extraordinary. There's frankly too much to talk about here. Where do you even begin? Actually, while it's still fresh in our minds, let's talk about this verse in Job 12, verse 11, which David Splane reads, which says,
Does not the ear test out words as the tongue tastes food?
Does not the ear test out words as the tongue tastes food? He's literally reading a verse that says, how are you going to test out the words unless you hear them? That's what I'm taking away from this verse. But he then goes on to apply the scripture to say something completely different that isn't in the text.
Does it mean that if we learn that apostates are going to be featured on a TV program, we should watch it to see if what they say is true? No. It basically means to consider the source of the words.
It doesn't say anything in that verse about the source of the words. It simply talks about testing out the words. And how can you test out the words if you don't know what the words are? Again, putting words in the mouths of the Bible writers. This is a man who apparently thinks that the Bible is God's inspired, infallible word. Well, if he really believes that, why is he literally changing the text? Why is he reading something that has a very clear meaning and application and then immediately twisting it to say something that it simply doesn't say? And as to this stuff about hearing both sides of the issue, I mean, really, he says,
some news organizations are very conscientious about their reporting, and they want to present both sides of an issue. And when Jehovah's Witnesses are concerned, they do so at their cost.
My question would be, David, do you report both sides of the issue? Do you, in your propaganda, say, of course, here's an argument against what we're saying? Or do you actually go to great lengths to stop Jehovah's Witnesses from seeing the other side of the issue? How can David Splane, how can the governing body sneer at news organizations for, in their view, not fully exploring both sides of the issue, when they are literally producing a 34-minute talk that emphatically tells Jehovah's Witnesses, under no circumstances look at the other side of the issue, under no circumstances scrutinize your beliefs in any way, or listen to what apostates have to say. We then have this stuff about government officials, which I can only assume is some kind of desperate lashing out at the Australian Royal Commission.
Some government officials are taken in. They believe the slanderous accusations of the apostates. Now, if they just take the time to check the facts, they'd see that they're being lied to, but they don't check the facts.
What facts? What government officials? What slanderous accusations? You're not giving us any examples. You're not dignifying your audience by telling them what the hell you're talking about. You're just telling them, oh, government officials are being lied to. Well, that's a huge claim. And if you're going to make that claim and expect your audience to take it seriously, dignify them as adults and tell them what you're talking about specifically. If you're just going to make these vague, sweeping claims about government officials falling for what apostates are saying, how can you possibly expect to be taken seriously? Again, this is nothing more than fear-mongering, stoking paranoia, and overt manipulation.